Hello, students. Today, we're going to begin our discussion of 20th century literature with a focus on Irish literature. Joining me for this segment of the course will be Professor M. Keith Booker of the University of Arkansas. Professor Booker is a noted and widely published scholar and critic of modern literature and culture, including modern Irish literature. He has written and published more than 50 books, including 2 books and a number of essays on James Joyce. I am so excited that Professor Booker is joining me today. Hello, Professor Booker, and thank you for being here today.
I'm happy to be here.
All right, let's begin. So, since the literary works we have discussed thus far were from the Victorian period, and since we will be moving now into the modern period, this might be a good time to stop for a moment to discuss the concept of literary periods in general. What is the concept of a period? Much literary scholarship depends upon the concept of periodization. So, periodization assumes that most literary text that you're dealing with and that is being produced at a given time and place are driven by similar assumptions about the world and will thus have similar characteristics. We have been looking at the Victorian period, like I've already mentioned, in British literature, and now we're going to be moving into the modern period of the 20th century. Ireland will be the focus of our reading in the rest of the semester. Dublin, the capital of the capital of the Republic of Ireland, is the setting of James Joyce's Dubliners, and this city was relatively small, a small colonial city with less than 1/10 the population of London. Dublin was informed by both Catholic conservatism and anti-colonial radicalism. So these two things produced a complex social and political climate in Dublin. The concept of the modern is informed by the historical phenomenon of modernity, though it is important to recognize that historians use the term modernity in 2 different ways. First, modernity is used to refer to the long period of historical transformation from the Renaissance through the Enlightenment to the present. It is also used to designate the shorter period from the 1890s through the 1930s. This period was a period of particularly rapid transformation due largely to a fundamental transformation in capitalism itself. Now, the 19th century capitalism was dominated by an emphasis on production, but then this new form of capitalism was and is still is dominated by an emphasis on consumption, and it's called consumerist capitalism. Now, the beginning of the 20th century was widely seen as the dawn of a new era, and Professor Booker is going to tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think one of the most distinctive characteristics of this period was how widespread was the feeling, especially in the Western world, that history was reaching some kind of crucial period and that it was going to go in some radically new direction, though it wasn't clear to a lot of people whether this was going to be a better direction or a worse direction. The British historian Eric Hobsbawm has described this, I think, very well when he notes that this period was marked by an intense sense of what he phrases as the imminent death of one world and the need for another, unquote. So there's this sense that the Victorian world is being swept off the historical stage to be replaced by some as yet undefined new world.
Exactly. So, one of the reasons why this period is especially interesting in literary history is because is because the way in which writers and artists responded to this perceived a crisis. A lot of these writers and artists sought new modes of expression that would be really consistent and more appropriate to the emerging new world of modernity. This quest also led to the birth of literary modernism. The spread of public education also created a growing readership for popular literature, and we're going to talk a little bit on this in a while. Now we're going to talk on the rise of modernism. So, as the 20th century was approaching, like we said, this time was met by a sense of crisis that basically was felt by many artists and writers, and that they had this belief that for better or worse, society was on the brink of a dramatic transformation. And so those artists felt like they needed new ways, and they should have new forms of expression to be consistent with this changing world. The most important trend toward these new forms of expression came to be known as modernism. And some modernists also were reacting against the rise of popular literature at that time. Professor Booker, tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, I think that last point's an important one that helps to show just how complex modernism was. I mean, on the surface, as you said, it's driven by this sense that the old ways of creating literature, including realism, which was the dominant literary form of the 19th century, were just becoming obsolete, that the world had changed so much that the literature of the past was no longer really relevant to the present. And if you wanted to construct something that was relevant, you couldn't just copy the literature of the past. You had to find something completely new. So to that extent, modernism can be seen as a revolt against realism. At the same time, you mentioned earlier the rise of this new popular literature at this time, which was typically written for people with about a fourth grade level of literacy. And a lot of people felt that this was sort of a dumbing down of literature, and that it would reduce the overall quality of Western literature. And so some modernists like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, for example, intentionally created very complex, difficult works that only fairly sophisticated and educated readers would have access to, because they wanted to have something that was somehow above the level of these fourth grade readers.
Yeah, but James Joyce, who was actually the most recognized of all these modernists, did not use that same method, right?
Right, and I think that that's another thing that shows the complexity of modernism, because ideologically, Joyce is almost the opposite of Pound and Eliot, who are very elitist and very conservative. Joyce is very democratic and very liberal, if not outright radical.
Yeah. No, now modernism was a very broad movement that included virtually every aspect of Western culture, from literature and art to music and architecture. Professor Booker is going to tell us a little bit about modern architecture.
Yeah, I think that one of the ways in which you can see modernism most distinctly is in architecture, because a lot of the architecture of this period was so different from Victorian architecture, which tended to be very ornate and have all kinds of frills and decorations on the buildings. But modernist architecture tended to be relatively plain, even though it did often, as in this picture, try to capture a sense of being sort of futuristic and modern. I think another thing that's important about modernist architecture is that, unlike modernist literature, it really became the dominant form of architecture. In literature, realism continued to be the dominant form, and really still is today. But modernism was a particularly striking and influential kind of attempt to seek something as an alternative to realism.
Very interesting. Next picture.
And this is a picture of the Bauhaus building from 1926 in Germany. The Bauhaus movement was one of the leading movements in modernist architecture. It's very strongly informed by an emphasis on plainness. Everything's right angles, everything's rectangles, everything's very flat and plain. There's no decorative frills added whatsoever. The emphasis is on efficiency. And again, this fit in with this sense of a new modern world where everything was moving rapidly. You had this fast pace of life. And so you needed buildings that were going to be efficient and be able to keep up with this new modern style of life.
Yes. Third picture.
And here's another one from London in 1935, High Point 1, which is basically just an apartment building. And you can see again that same kind of emphasis on right angles and rectangles and no ornamentation at all.
Yes. Now, there are basic characteristics of literary modernism. A sense of intense social, political, and cultural crisis, complex relation to the literary tradition and to the past in general, and we've already discussed this one. A rejection of realism, but when it comes to literature, like we said, I mean, probably until this day, realism is the dominant mode. Formal complexity and experimentalism, including intense self-consciousness and focus on art as the subject of art. An exploration of the nature of human subjectivity suggests a sense that subjectivity is in crisis.
Yeah, I think this last point is important because it shows the extent to which these transformations in various aspects of modern society were so dramatic that a lot of modernist artists in particular felt that the whole concept of what it meant to be a human being and what the nature of human beings was itself being transformed, so that human beings were really a different thing than they had been, say, 50 years earlier. And again, all the modernists responded to this in different ways. The architecture responded to it with this plain, flat kind of style, and then literature and painting generally responded in much more complex styles.
Yeah, and we're going to take a look at that response in art. Here is a painting here by Picasso, Guernica, 1937. It's one of Picasso's Cubist pieces. And Picasso's Cubist technique was only one of a number of modernist techniques, all of which were designed to convey certain modernist themes. And Professor Booker is going to explain the theme over here.
Well, Guernica in particular is a painting describing a real event that occurred during the Spanish Civil War, in which the city of Guernica, which was being held by the duly elected government of Spain, which was very left-wing and progressive, they were under assault by the fascist forces of Francisco Franco, and the fascists basically just destroyed the whole town with heavy bombing. And you can see here that kind of sense of terror and confusion and violence that Picasso tries to convey by the ways in which he's sort of broken all of these shapes and figures into pieces and then glued them back together in some kind of fractured form to create that sense of a world being blown apart.
Exactly. So there are key modernist themes that we will see in the stories that we're gonna read by James Joyce. So let's just point them out. Art and the special role of the artist, alienation and the loss of shared values, a quickened pace of life and the regimentation of time, the urban experience, probing psychological depth, and new frankness and detail in dealing with sexuality. We're going to see these themes and how they play out in the stories when we get to them. Okay. James Joyce, a modernist icon. He was born in 1882 and died in 1941. Born in Dublin to a declining middle class family, in 1904, James Joyce left Dublin for continental Europe, where he lived the remainder of his life. Dubliners was published in 1914, though most of the stories were written by 1904. So maybe if someone wonders, like, how would Joyce know about life in Dublin and what was happening since he was already gone, it's because he really wrote the majority of the stories when he was still in Ireland. And Dubliners is Joyce's only collection of short stories. We have a portrait of the artist as a young man. And we have, of course, his most important work, Ulysses, published in 1922, and Finnegan's Wake, 1939. Would you like to comment and say anything about Ulysses?
Well, I think Ulysses is not only Joyce's most important work, you could argue that it's the most important work in all of world literature, certainly the most important 20th century work, and it's routinely named the greatest novel of the 20th century in various surveys of critics and readers. And it really is a kind of spectacular modernist artifact. It is the epitome of modernism. If you could only look at one book to see what modernism is like, Ulysses would be the place to look. And Joyce is so influential that almost every writer after 1922 has been influenced by Ulysses in one way or another. But to the point where we have this adjective where we say Joycean. If you try to describe what a writer's writing is like, you say, "Oh, well, it's very Joycean." But curiously enough, Dubliners, the one Joyce work that you'll actually be looking at in this course, is not very Joycean. Dubliners is almost the opposite of what you mean by Joycean. Partly because, again, it was written when Joyce was very young, and he himself hadn't become James Joyce yet. He hadn't fully developed his technique.
True.
But partly because almost everything Joyce did was an experiment. I mean, every book is completely different from the book that came before, so he was constantly changing his style and his technique. Again, that's one of the hallmarks of modernism is constant experimentation. And one of the things that's remarkable about Dubliners is that you have this whole collection of stories, all of which are written essentially in a naturalist vein, even though Joyce always has a few little flourishes that go beyond the kind of stripped down technique that you usually associate with naturalism. But then The Dead suddenly emerges as a modernist story, which sort of revises the whole reception of the book because it's written in a completely different mode than the earlier stories. And so what makes Dubliners remarkable then is you essentially can see in a way the birth of literary modernism in this one book.
The transition.
Starts out rooted in, he's very rooted in the 19th century in the beginning of the book and really stays there all the way up through all the stories prior to The Dead. But then when he gets into The Dead, and there were a few years gap in the writing between any of the other stories in The Dead, so that's part of what goes on. But I think Joyce had really struggled with writing that novel Stephen Hero, which was also in the 19th century vein. And when he realized that just wasn't working for him anymore, he went back and wrote The Dead to finish off Dubliners in a very, very different mode. And The Dead is very lively. It's very funny. It has lots of wordplay. It has lots of verbal pyrotechnics. It's totally different from the other stories in Dubliners. So it makes for a really interesting comparison.
So in a way, you really kind of need to be a Joyce scholar to really understand The Dead.
I think it's difficult to understand The Dead fully out of context because it is it's so
Exactly.
important the way that it relates to the other Dubliner stories. It really transitions into Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man because it's written in somewhat the same mode as A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which was Joyce's first modernist novel.
Exactly. Dubliners features several key themes, and those themes also resemble the ones that we just mentioned, themes that you would always basically see in modernist writing. So, alienation in the modern city is a key modernist concern by many writers. But then Ireland here, because of its colonial position, and because of the Catholic Church, they really have a particularly um, um, complex status, and so it's a city, and it's kind of modern, but then at the same time, it's has this oppressive environment because of these two forces. Individuals in Dublin repeatedly seek ways creatively to define their identities, but of course, they repeatedly fail. And we'll see that throughout all of the stories. The style of writing in Dubliners uh, is stripped down, barren. The vocabulary really reflects Joyce's view of the poverty of life in Dublin.
Yeah, I think prior to the Dead, the entire vocabulary of Dubliners is less than 1,000 words,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to the vocabulary of the complete works of Shakespeare, which is about 14,000 words. And when Shakespeare is, of course, famed for his vast vocabulary and for literally having invented a lot of English words.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you get to Ulysses has over 30,000 different words in it, so its vocabulary is vast. But then Finnegan's Wake has over 60,000 words, although the majority of them aren't actual English words; they're just words that Joyce made up.
Mm-hmm.
That's why
Mm-hmm.
Finnegan's Wake is often considered the most difficult book to read that was ever written because it's not even written in English. It's written from a complex combination of influences from over 60 different world languages.
Very interesting.
Dubliners, though, is again just the opposite of that. Until the Dead, it is very stripped down and barren and has a very
Yes.
limited vocabulary.
Yes. This is a picture here of Dublin in 1904, um, almost around the time of the action of Dubliners. Now we're going to be talking on Irish history, a servant of two masters. Professor Booker, who are the two masters?
The Two Masters, this is actually a quote from Ulysses,
Mm-hmm.
where Stephen Dedalus, one of the main characters in Ulysses, and the main character of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man,
Mm-hmm.
is trying to sum up Irish history in one phrase. And he says the Irish are a servant of two masters. Those two masters being, of course, the British Empire and the Catholic Church. And he felt that basically Ireland was being oppressed by both of them and limited and unable to really reach its potential because of all the constraints that were placed on people by these two outside forces.
Exactly. Let's just see where Ireland is relative to Britain. Um, Professor Booker, if you want to talk a little on this map.
Yeah, you can see here these two large islands off the northwestern coast of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
The one on the right, containing England, Wales, and Scotland, is most of what we refer to as Great Britain. The one on the left, or to the west, is the island of Ireland. You'll notice though here there's two different parts. There's the Republic of Ireland, which is the lower part in sort of light green, and then there's Northern Ireland in orange. The reason Northern Ireland is in orange is because it's actually part of Great Britain and
Mm-hmm.
not part of the Republic of Ireland. This was because there's a lot of animosity between Catholics and Protestants in Ireland, and most of the people in the Republic of Ireland are Catholics, whereas most of the people in Northern Ireland are Protestants. And so, culturally, in many ways, the people in Northern Ireland feel more of an affinity for Great Britain than they do for the Republic of Ireland. And so, that part of Ireland, when Ireland gained their independence, that part of the island was sort of carved off and kept as part of Great Britain. Although there's still a lot of resentment over that, and a lot of people in Ireland, including in Northern Ireland for that matter, don't feel that that's appropriate, and that they feel like Northern Ireland should really be part of Ireland.
Yes. And we're going to look at a work that comes from Northern Ireland when we're done with Joyce, and that's going to be Dancing at Lunasa by Brian Friel. All right, so we're going to now look at how Ireland had been the slave of one of these masters, which is the British Empire. So, like I said, it had been a British colony since the 12th century. Uh, Frequent Irish rebellions against British rule had been brutally suppressed, leading to a considerable animosity toward Ireland's British rulers. This created a sense in the Irish of being cursed by history.
Yeah, I think the Irish colonial history led to a sort of a kind of complex attitude toward their own history on the part of the Irish. On the other hand, uh, their various attempts at rebellion were almost comically inept, and the Irish recognized that and thought of them in that way at times. But on the other hand, they also thought of a lot of the leaders of these rebellions as great
Mm-hmm.
heroes, and they were constantly heroizing the people from the past, which is something that Joyce thought was a real problem in Ireland. He felt like one of the reasons they couldn't get anywhere in the present was that they were too busy trying to glorify the past, even though the heroes in the past were all failures and had all failed to really accomplish anything. So he didn't feel like that was probably a very useful attitude to have. And you'll see that especially in The Dead, where he criticizes that kind of tendency to glorify people in the past.
Exactly. Then we have the potato famine that was a major event in that history. In 1845 to 1849, hundreds of thousands starved, and many others immigrated, especially to the United States. Um, um, Basically, between 1847 to 1854, 1.6 million Irish people went to the United States, and the Irish population fell from 8.5 million in 1845 to 6.5 million in 1851. The current population right now is around 6.6 million, 1.8 million of whom are in Northern Ireland, because we said they're like just like two countries, and there are 34.5 million Irish Americans, and so there are basically more Irish people in America than there are in Ireland.
Far more, and that's one reason
Mm-hmm.
why there's such strong cultural affinities between Ireland and America. I myself am an Irish American, for example.
Yeah, that's very interesting. At this point, the Irish nationalism begins to take shape in the late 19th century. In 1869, Church of England disestablishes as State Church of Ireland. In 1870s, there was a growing agitation for home rule with support from the British Prime Minister Gladstone. The votes in the Parliament failed in 1886 and 1893. In 1898, the Boer War happened. A big number of Irish men conscripted for service in South Africa, and at this point, there was a growing resentment toward the British Empire, as the Irish felt that the Irish soldiers were used by the British as cannon fodder. Here we have Irish resistance to the colonial rule finally gains momentum. So in 1899, Irish Literary Theatre was founded, and in 1905, Arthur Griffith founds the Sinn Féin, We Ourselves, and 1914 Home Rule was finally approved, then quickly rescinded because of the outbreak of World War One. In Easter 1916, we have the Easter Rising led by Patrick Pearse and James Connolly.
Yeah, I think that the 1914 situation shows you just how unlucky the Irish were historically, because they finally get home rule, and then suddenly World War I breaks out, and the British say, "Oh, well, wait a minute, we better keep control of Ireland because we might need it in World War I." And the Easter Rising, in some ways, is similar. I mean, it was sort of a sacrificial kind of event in which the Irish rebels had no chance of succeeding. But what they were kind of hoping was that since they were in the middle of World War I, that maybe the Germans would come to their aid, but it just didn't happen. And so they were basically just mowed down. Most of their leaders were rounded up and shot by firing squads afterward. One of the most famous poems by W.B. Yeats, the greatest Irish poet, is called Easter 1916, and it's about that event. Yes. But it's an interesting event because even though it seemed to be another example of Irish failure, it caused such a flurry of anti-British sentiment that in some ways it ultimately led, at least indirectly, to Irish independence.
That's true.
Because it was just impossible after that point for the British to maintain control of Ireland. And it's also, I think, important to recognize all these things are going on in this period that we characterized as modernity earlier. There's all these sweeping changes in the world, and the Irish kind of felt like, well, okay, if the world is changing, then how come we're still in this same colonial situation? Shouldn't our situation be changing also?
Yeah, I mean, again, that's a very interesting era in history because of all that rapid change that was happening. And we said, I mean, since the 12th century, the Irish, they've been fighting to gain their independence. But then, like you said, this was just this time that major changes were happening, that it was like, this is the moment. This is when it's supposed to happen. The aftermath of the Easter Rising soon led to the establishment of the Irish Free State, followed by the Civil War. In 1918, Sinn Féin sweeps parliamentary elections in Ireland, but the members refused to take their seats in Westminster and instead established the Dáil Éireann and proclaim an Irish Republic. In 1919 and 1921, Anglo-Irish War, the Irish Republican Army founded, and in January 1922, Irish Free State established, triggering a civil war with Eamon de Valera as nominal leader of the insurgents. Free State forces win with British support. Any comment here?
Well, I think that, again, it's just an indication of Irish hard luck in a way. You know, they finally established the Free State, but so many people were unhappy with the terms under which the Free State had been established, which essentially left Britain in control of Ireland, but allowed Ireland to have a limited autonomy in terms of domestic issues. And so the Irish ended up, breaking into a civil war among themselves, between those who supported the Free State and those like de Valera who wanted something more extensive.
Exactly.
And of course, the Free State forces won because they had British support.
True. Now, Ireland after independence, in 1932, De Valera becomes head of the government. He served as prime minister until 1959 and then returned in 1973 as the president. In 1937, new constitution terminates Great Britain's sovereignty except in Northern Ireland, and we've already talked about this. In 1948, Republic of Ireland formed, leaves British Commonwealth.
Yeah, I think the ascent of De Valera to the head of the government is really important because it was during De Valera's term as prime minister that Dancing at Lunasa takes place. So that's something to keep in mind, and it's a very, very important part of the background of
Yes,
that play. De
exactly.
Valera, De Valera was a very interesting figure in the sense that he was one of the leaders of the rebels in the Easter Rising, but he actually wasn't executed after that rebellion because he was an American citizen. He was actually born in New York, and the British were heavily engaged in trying to get the Americans to enter World War I on their side, and so they didn't want to alienate Irish Americans by executing De Valera, and so they spared him, and he then went on again to be a sort of radical. He was one of the more radical leaders of the Irish independence movement in the Civil War. But then by the time he became prime minister, he had completely shifted in the other direction and was really very right wing.
True.
The 30s, of course, are the period of fascism in Europe, and De Valera was essentially, ideologically at least, aligned with the fascists in Italy and Spain and Germany.
Yeah, and I always tell my students to keep these historical facts and the political situation here in mind. So when we get to the stories in Dubliners, and actually, most importantly, the ones related to De Valera in mind, because he figures in Dancing at Lunasa and the political context there. I mean, if you just don't know who he is, if you're reading the play, then you're just not going to understand what the characters are referring to and what they mean, right?
Correct.
So, okay. Now, literature, especially poetry and theater, were key elements of Irish nationalism. Now, the Irish felt that for a very long time through their colonial past, their indigenous culture had essentially been destroyed. We have centuries of Catholicism and English rule that basically were suppressing these people to the point that they have lost their indigenous culture, like I've pointed out. So by the end of the 19th century, Ireland had no cultural identity except that as a British colony. And so the Irish nationalists decided to produce a national literature that was truly Irish to help generate such an identity. And it was called the Gaelic Revival. Then they attempted to resurrect the Irish language, but had a little success. Actually, even James Joyce was approached to write in Gaelic, right? Am I right?
Yeah, no, he was one of the young writers. He was already recognized. He hadn't really written anything much yet, but they recognized that he was really gifted, and he was encouraged to. And he was also really good with languages. Like Joyce, he wanted to read Ibsen in the original, so he taught himself Norwegian. And he was completely fluent in French and Italian as well as English. So he was one of the people they felt could probably learn the Irish language. Almost nobody in Ireland knew Irish anymore, of course. But they felt that he could learn to write because he was so gifted linguistically. And he said, yeah, I probably could learn to write in Irish, but there's a problem with that. Nobody can read Irish, so what would be the point of writing in Irish?
Exactly.
And so he decided it would be better just to write in English, but to sort of make English his own language instead of just following English models, British models slavishly. One of the reasons why his work became so lavish and experimental linguistically is that he was sort of trying to decolonize the English language and make it his own language, and instead of just following British models.
Exactly, and I think we've talked about this in another lecture when we were talking about the Romantics and the way they wrote, and that there's a certain discourse that they follow. So there's a tradition, and then if you imitate that tradition, then that makes you a great writer. And so someone like Joyce said, when he was approached, he said, "How about I write in English and do it better than English writers?" And so
the irony being, of course, that by the time he gets to Finnegan's Wake, he ends up still writing in a language that nobody can read.
exactly. So we have a number of important writers who emerged from that movement. We have William Butler Yeats, who becomes one of the most important poets of the 20th century. The Irish National Theatre, the Abbey Theatre, was particularly successful, producing major dramatists such as Sean O'Casey and John Millington Synge, and also fiction writers such as Joyce led to Ireland's contribution to world literature, and we've already talked about this.
Yeah, again, another irony, though, because the Irish nationalist movement emphasized poetry and theater, but it ultimately would be in fiction, in the works of writers like Joyce and Flann O'Brien and Samuel Beckett, that Irish literature would be most important.
Exactly, that's true. Here's a picture of the Abbey Theatre in 1904 when it first opened.
This is the building that housed the Irish National Theatre, which was really the center of the Gaelic revival.
Yes. Here's the Abbey Theatre, the interior of the theatre, also from 1904.
You can see it's relatively small and modest.
Yes.
You know, Dublin was a small, modest city, but it was very culturally important to the Irish.
Of course. And here's a picture of the Abbey Theatre today, because the original building was burnt in 1951, and so the current building opened in 1966.
And I think this is kind of a good place to end, because you can see how now it's modern and it's much fancier and it looks, you know, more affluent, because after all this long history of being a kind of poor, backwards, oppressed country, and you'll see that even as late as 1990, when Dancing at Lunasis being written by Brian Friel, Ireland was still very poor relative to most of Western Europe. But in the course of the 90s, the Irish economy was transformed. They called it the Gaelic Tiger,
Yes.
and became one of the most dynamic economies in Europe. In fact, Ireland now has the highest per capita income of any country in Europe, much higher than Britain, higher than the United States, higher than Kuwait. I mean, it's a really rich country at this point because of the transformation in their economy at that time. And it's also become a very modern liberal country that's finally broken free of the control of the Catholic Church over all of their social policies. So
That's true.
Ireland's really a very different place than it was through most of its history. It's kind of the place to be in Europe at this point.
That's true, and that's why I actually always like to point out everything that you just said to my students prior to beginning our study of Dubliners, because I just want them to realize that what was then and what was James Joyce's criticism of the Irish society is really not present these days.
But frankly, most of the elements that led to that transformation were basically things that Joyce would have recommended. They finally got around to taking Joyce's advice, and it changed the whole country.
Exactly, but it was like a real sweeping change that I mean, ultimately, that was the vision: is that you cannot just have one foot in the past and one foot in the present. That's just a recipe for disaster. You need to go like full force into the future and just be modern and take whatever that entails, right?
Correct. And Ireland now has one of the most high-tech manufacturing systems in all of the world. I mean, if you want to, there were really three things that led to the economic transformation of Ireland: technology, technology, and technology.
Exactly. And so that's the end of today's lecture. And we will see you guys soon in our second part of this 20th century literature discussing James Joyce next time. Thank you, Professor Booker, for helping out.
Thanks for having me.